Do your lessons ever feel like a mix of good activities that just don't quite connect? Well, you're not alone, and it's frustrating when all your effort doesn't lead to real language growth. Well, in this episode, we're talking about how to plan intentionally. So from the first input to the final assessment, so that everything works together to build proficiency. You'll get practical ideas, a clear framework, and a fresh approach that makes planning easier and more effective. So let's jump in. Whether you're planning your first lesson or celebrating your 20th year in the language classroom, I understand exactly where you are. I'm Joshua Cabral, and I'm also a language teacher in my 29th year of teaching. Now, I also have the opportunity to support schools and teachers all across the country who are working towards increasing proficiency and building confidence in their students. This is the World Language Classroom Podcast, with over 200 episodes of practical strategies tested in real classrooms just like yours and mine. So let's jump in. Vamos, allons-y. Hello, my friends. Bonjour, mes amis. Hola, mis amigos. Welcome to the World Language Classroom Podcast. I am Joshua Cabral, and thank you, as always, for spending this time with me and being a language teacher that listens to a podcast about language teaching. That makes you a total rock star in my mind, so thank you so much for doing that and for everything you put into your work as a teacher and everything you do to support your students. So thank you very much for that. So we're going to talk about planning today. And not just planning, but this idea of really doing it in an intentional way. So have you had that experience where you sit down to plan a lesson and you think, okay, so we're going to do this reading, which I found was really interesting, and then we'll do a quick speaking activity and maybe a vocab game, and I'll guess I give a quiz at the end of the week, but after all that, I'm still wondering, what exactly are my students walking away with? They enjoyed the vocabulary game, they really liked the reading that we did, but were they actually connected? And I ask you if you have that feeling. Maybe you do, maybe you don't sometimes, but I can tell you that early on in my career, I was constantly planning activities, so many activities. But looking back, I wasn't always sure if those activities were building toward anything that was proficiency-based. I knew they were fun, the students were engaged, they were participating, but I wasn't always sure that it was overall connected to what they were going to be doing at the end. And I knew I was working hard and my students were busy, but were they actually growing in proficiency in what they were able to do in the target language? That was the real question. And when I was awakened to this whole idea of proficiency, almost 2 decades ago now, when I think about it, I was really looking at all of those activities and working hard to create them. And it's not a question of not doing them, but figuring out how to do them in a way that are connected so that they build toward that final assessment. So if this hits home for you at all, just know that you're definitely not alone. But we can shift it so that our planning uses all of these activities that we enjoy, but to tweak them or to do them in a certain way or in a certain order that is truly designing lessons that intentionally build communication skills from that very first day of the unit and however you're doing the input all the way to that final assessment. So let's walk through it. So we have this idea of how we can make sure that it is intentional and almost feels seamless so that everything that we're doing is building towards that final assessment. Now, one thing I want to just say is that this can come off as sounding like you're teaching towards the test. And typically when we hear that idea, it's because we know the discrete vocabulary or grammar points that are on the test, and you're teaching just those to make sure the student does well on it. Sometimes that happens even with standardized tests. That's not at all what I'm advocating for. When we talk about backwards planning and planning for proficiency, that final assessment is not about discrete point grammar. It's not about talking about the language or explaining details of the language or translating vocabulary. If that's what it were, and that's what you were doing in your units, that would be planning towards the test. But when we're talking about an assessment at the end, it's an assessment of skill and performance towards proficiency. And so we are teaching towards students building those skills so that they can perform on that assessment. So when I give this idea of planning backwards so that we're planning towards the assessment, it's not about planning towards the test, but about developing the skills along the way so that left to their own devices, they can use those skills to perform on the assessment. So let's look at the big idea of the shift first. And so we have to start planning with the goal of communication in mind and not necessarily the content. And yes, they will be involved in content, but we're more looking at the skills. What are the language functions? Are they narrating? Are they explaining? Are they asking questions? Are they answering questions? What's the function? So essentially, when you're talking about what they're doing with the language, you can swap out the content because you're staying true to what that proficiency goal is. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about this assessment at the end. So yes, of course, there's content embedded in it, but it's not necessarily testing their knowledge of the content, but how they're able to engage with the content with their language skills. So the end goal is communication and not necessarily the content, although that's a good byproduct. It's not about a particular textbook unit, and it's not even about a particular grammar point. It's how they use that grammar point in the context. So communication is what we want them to do at the end. So when we think about what students need to be able to do with language, meaning what will they be able to say, what will they be able to write or understand when they listen or read, once we have that in mind, what we want them to do, that's where we plan backwards from there. So everything starts to click into place when you start by saying, I want them to be able to say this. I want them to be able to write this. Then all of your activities, you want to say, okay, is that in line with getting them to that endpoint of being able to do that? So suddenly, and I'm saying it like you're having this epiphany, but suddenly you have this reading, and it's not just a random reading that you found interesting, but there's input in it that feeds into a communicative task. And that speaking activity isn't just a fun practice, it's a bridge toward the real-world assessment. And then the assessment, well, it finally matches what students actually practiced. So if you want them to be able to discuss their daily routines, then your reading should be about daily routines. And then the follow-up into personal activity or writing activity based on that reading, so you can see how they are all connected and they're all honing those skills to move them up towards the end when they're going to take that assessment. So this is the foundation of backwards design, and it's intentional planning. I'm calling it intentional planning. Most people would call it backwards design. So it's not a new idea, but in the world language classroom, we can sometimes forget how effective it can be when every piece is aligned around proficiency. So let's look at some classroom strategies for making this happen. Let's get really practical about this. I'm going to share two ideas here because I don't want to overwhelm everything as you're listening to this. So here's two ideas so you can start to ponder these. So you could take these into your classroom right now and begin planning more intentionally without reworking your entire curriculum. And the first strategy is to start with the I can statement. So before you plan anything, I want you to write your target I can statements. I would say there's multiple at the top of your plan. So something like, I can describe what I do after school and compare it to someone else's routine. So that would be an interpersonal speaking. Maybe that's even a presentational speaking, however you want them to do that. But that is one of the modes. Or you could have something like, I can understand a short text about holiday traditions in another culture. You could get specific about what the tradition is in what culture. So it's very specific to your actual content. So I would say what I do is I write a can-do statement for each unit with a mode in mind. So I can say or I can describe, usually for me, that's either interpersonal speaking or presentational speaking. I can write a blog post about. I can write a social media comment about. So whatever that is in writing, I can understand a video that explains some sort of tradition. Or I can read and discuss a short article about. So whatever it is, I make sure my can-do statements are in line with the different modes. So once you have those, then ask yourself, the input that you're using, does it directly support this outcome? So you likely have those go-to activities that you've done in this unit. But if you now start with those can-do statements and you look at those activities that you've done in that unit and you ask yourself, does the input I'm using directly support this outcome? Is the video that you've always used in this unit, does it help them to be able to describe those traditions or talk about their daily routine, whatever it is you have as your can-do statement? And then are students seeing the vocabulary and the structures and the cultural references that they need? So just because you've always done the preterite in this unit, but your can-do statement has nothing to do about talking in the past, then does the preterite fit in well here? So you have to ask yourself that question. And are the tasks asking students to do exactly what the I can statement is saying? So making sure that your tasks are aligned with that. So I think when you go back and you look at your activities after you've written your I can statements, then you can really see if they're aligned. So now the next thing to do, the strategy, is to align your input, your task, and your assessment. So now let's say that your end goal is for students to compare their daily routine to someone else's in writing. That's what you did for your presentational writing can-do statement. So here's how you would align that process. So now you want to make sure that you have input that is perhaps a video or a text that shows or describes a teen's daily routine in the target language culture. And then your task is for students to highlight similarities and differences, maybe through a graphic organizer or a short paired discussion, but some way of highlighting those similarities and differences. And then the assessment would be for students to write 4 or 5, maybe 6 connected sentences comparing their own routine to the teens that they saw in the video or that they read about in the text. So you'll see in here that there's nothing extra. There's no random vocabulary or unrelated grammar point or worksheet. It's just focused and it's intentional practice that builds toward that goal. And when you have those can-do statements and you look at your activities and you constantly ask, is it going to help them build the skill to take that assessment at the end? So now you might be thinking, but there's always these fun activities that we like to do. We do trash-get-ball and whatever you want to call it in your classrooms and the things that get the kids really excited and all that. And you could be listening to this and saying, but, Joshua, now you're saying that all this stuff is not directly influencing what they're going to do in that assessment. And so you said there's nothing extra, so we just take it out. And so where's the joy? So I just want to say that there is absolutely a place for fun and engagement in the classroom. We just want to make sure that those games and activities that students do enjoy are aligned with the vocabulary and structures they need to meet those I can goals. So tweak them as necessary. Change what the prompts are to make sure that they directly help them move toward the proficiency and the performance needed to do well on that assessment. So it's not about taking those activities out, but just to make sure that if they're practicing phrases or they're practicing vocabulary, that it is specifically the vocabulary they're going to need. So there's absolutely a place for joy. I'm not saying don't do that. And there's also a place for looking at grammar and vocabulary that you had in mind for this unit originally that you've always done. And now that you have your I can statements and they don't exactly line up. Like there's a lot of vocabulary. There's some grammar points that don't actually align with doing that. So perhaps you use those grammar points and that vocabulary in another unit where it's going to be more appropriate rather than just sort of filler. And you can perhaps also modify your initial can-do statement because there are times when you absolutely need to include a particular grammar point or vocabulary list because you're following a curriculum that you're mandated to follow. I get that. So is there a way where you can take that and make a unit around it that is communicative, that finds a way to use that grammar and vocabulary? And it's not always the easiest thing. Particularly, there are some legacy textbooks where it doesn't line up exactly. It's not so communicative. So what you might try doing is leveraging AI for that. You could type in whatever that grammar and vocabulary you have to cover is in this unit and ask it to combine thematically and create viable can-do statements that include that. And it might come up with something a little random, but say, give me 10 ideas. And when you ask it for 10, you can usually find 2 or 3 that'll work well for you. The reality about students and their experience is that they expect to see what they covered throughout the unit on the assessment at the end. And so you want to make sure that what you're doing throughout the unit is truly focused on that, and it's not a bunch of other random stuff that you don't end up putting on the assessment just because you had to cover it. So find a way to either tweak your I can statements or to find a way to take that grammar and vocabulary that you have to cover and put it into another unit so that it fits better that way. So you can take these ideas, these I can statements, and you're planning backwards, and you can for sure put these ideas to work for you absolutely with success in your classroom. But if you're thinking that you might need a few more concrete examples or examples at different proficiency levels, or you could use a little more guidance on how to set it all up, well, that's exactly what you'll get in my Ready for Tomorrow Quick Win PD course that is entitled Intentional Planning for Proficiency from Input to Assessment. So in this course, in just 30 minutes, I walk you through a simple, repeatable framework to make sure that your input, your tasks, and your assessments are working together to build proficiency and not just fill time. So in this course, you will have an audio walkthrough where I will talk you through all of the details about how to do it, all of the examples, how to work through the template, how to do it in your classroom. So you can listen on your commute, while you're walking the dog, during your meal prep, just like you're doing with this podcast. But then in addition to that, you will have a sheet that has really detailed notes that organize all of the information for you, and then a planning template that you can use again and again, and also those specific examples at the novice, intermediate, and advanced levels that you could actually do in your classroom or use as your motivation and your guidance to create your own. And then there is a personalized certificate of completion to document your PD hours that you can get at the end. So there's a link in the show notes if you would like to get this Ready for Tomorrow Quick Win PD course on intentional planning for proficiency, or you can just go to my website, wlclassroom.com/intentional planning. So I want to leave you with a challenge. So this week, just once, I want you to plan a lesson backwards. So start with your I can statement, maybe just one, not all the modes, and then choose the input that supports that goal, and then design one communicative task that builds toward it. And make sure that your assessment matches exactly what students have practiced. I know that's a big, lofty challenge for the week, but start with your I can statement. Then choose input that supports that goal. So they're seeing that in action, whether in reading or listening. And then they do a communicative task that builds toward being able to do that. And then you make sure that your assessment matches either what they were reading, what they were listening to, or that interpersonal activity that they were doing. So just take a step back, look at it, and see how it feels. And then, did the lesson flow more naturally? Did your students know what was expected of them? Did it feel more purposeful? And if so, then you've just experienced what intentional planning for proficiency really looks like. So a lot to take in, I know, but planning for proficiency is so important. So if you'd like a little more guidance with this, be sure to take advantage of my Ready for Tomorrow Quick Win PD course, or you can just go to wlclassroom.com/intentional planning. So thank you so much for all of the incredible work you're doing to support your students. And want more ideas to bring proficiency-focused strategies into your teaching? Well, you'll find options for you and your school in the show notes and on my website. Well, I will talk to you soon. Bye for now. Thank you for listening. Be sure to follow or subscribe so you don't miss a single episode. And let's stay connected on social media. You can find me at WL Classroom pretty much everywhere. You'll also find lots of ideas, suggestions, and resources on my website, wlclassroom.com. Now stay curious, keep learning, and continue the great work you do inspiring and supporting your students.